Welcome to the Leadership School podcast. I'm your host, leadership and self-care coach, Kyla Kofer. Here at the Leadership School, you'll hear leaders from around the world sharing their stories and expertise on how to lead with balance and integrity. Our goal? Teach you how to be an extraordinary leader. Welcome back, everybody, to Leadership School podcast. I am your host, Kyla Kofer, and I'm here today with Beth Rashleigh. We have a lot to talk about in today's episode. We are talking all about crisis-proof leadership. What does it look like to lead during a crisis? And Beth walks us through 7 leadership competencies, different types of leaders that succeed and don't succeed, and just really the skills needed to be able to face a crisis in a leadership role and how you can prepare yourself for that. This is an extremely important episode, and it's bringing together a lot of things that we have talked about in recent episodes. So if you're going to listen to just one, this is the one I would choose. So thank you so much, Beth, for joining me here on the Leadership School podcast. I'm here with Beth Rashleigh. And Beth, thank you so much for joining me on the Leadership School podcast. I am seriously thrilled about this conversation after reading your book, and I think we have a lot to talk about. So why don't you just jump in and tell our guests about yourself, and then we'll go from there.
I love it. Thanks so much. I'm Beth Rashleigh. I am the owner of Rashleigh Consulting. I started my own leadership development and coaching practice 3 years ago, but I've been doing leadership development for almost 20 years now, which is a little bit depressing to think about. But I've mostly worked inside crisis environments. So all of my work experience, for whatever reason, I've always been drawn to jobs where the stakes are really high. So that has equaled for me healthcare or working at the Central Intelligence Agency, which is a strange combination of things. But the common thread point is crisis. And that's something I've always been really fascinated with. And that fascination kind of bubbled into a book last year. So I wrote a book called Crisis Proof Leadership. It came out in January of 2022. And it's just been a fun part of this work.
And it's such a good book. And I mean, we just have a lot to talk about today.
We really do. I'm glad you enjoyed it.
So many different things to talk about in the book. So I really want to get into all of them. You just mentioned that you've done healthcare and working for the CIA. So those are very different. So maybe you tell us a little bit about both of those and how you involved in the crisis. Because when I see the CIA, I think, yeah, you can work in jobs there that might be like high stakes, but also I can think there might be jobs there like a janitor. So like
Absolutely.
what that might not necessarily be high stakes. So tell us a little bit more about your roles and why the stakes were so high in those roles.
What I equate high stakes to is, does the work product matter? Does that make sense? So like, does the thing that you're doing or the thing you're contributing to matter? Is it a life or death? And a lot of times at the CIA, the answer to that is yes. Now, my jobs were always training related at the CIA. So when I very first started there, my very first job, I was 27. My very first job, I taught people how to properly file emails so that they could be discoverable when people had like FOIA requests, Freedom of Information Act requests. So really glamorous training job that I had when I first started. And then that evolved into teaching people how to properly classify documents. And then over the years, like I got a little bit of street cred as a decent trainer, and I met some people that worked in the leadership school. And I actually spent a big chunk of my career at a place called the National Reconnaissance Office, which is the part of the intelligence community that launches and maintains spy satellites. But they're their own. It used to be back in the day. Now they have their own employees, but everybody who worked there was matrixed in some way. So nobody was really an NRO employee except for the director. Everybody worked somewhere else. So I was a CIA employee who worked there. There were Air Force people who worked there, NSA people, Navy, lots of different mix. So it was a really fascinating environment to start teaching leadership in, because there's a lot of different perspectives, a lot of people being taught things in their own organizations, a lot of people matrixed in a really specific way. So that's where I really started in this leadership world. I had an HR background before that. So before I really got into the training, I had worked in HR and healthcare. So doing things like nurse recruiting, employee relations, all the crises that come with employee issues. And then after I left the CIA, I went right back to healthcare. So I worked in healthcare for 6 or 7 more years before I went out on my own. So it's an interesting career path, but like it, when I tell people about it, I honestly, the common thread I promise you is the importance of mission, the importance of the thing that you're doing.
Well, I'm glad you said that, because when you said that you were working with people from all different organizations,
Yeah, the
I'm
NRF,
thinking,
yep.
how did you all work together? Like, with everybody kind of, yeah, you have the same place that you're working, but you're coming from so many different places and you're trying to all figure out how to work together on projects. And that sounds very complex.
Yeah, it could be. But for the most part, I mean, the people who worked there were just phenomenal humans. I never had issues with, oh, you're CIA and I'm an Air Force civilian, and so therefore I'm better than you, or you're better. Like, there just wasn't a lot of that. Part of it is because the culture of that agency tends to be its own weird thing. Like, everybody knows that's the situation. It's not going to be very fruitful to try to, get into situations like that. So for the most part, people didn't. I think there were a couple, I had military students who would say there was some of that in their area. But for the most part, it's not something that was a huge issue.
And you guys all had this common mission and vision and purpose and goals that you were working towards, because you mentioned that just a second ago.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I'm really glad for this conversation, because when I originally started this podcast and was starting to interview people, I thought I really want to interview people who have led during a crisis, because that's when leadership really shows up and matters, and you see who the strong leaders are. And we just went through this major crisis of the pandemic, and you could see like leaders who really stepped up. And there are a lot of leaders who are going to step up into the roles. But when I'm talking about leadership, I'm talking about a successful leader, someone who's really bringing people along into the story, someone who's really growing their company, organization, their people in a positive way that actually makes a positive impact. And so we have a lot of leaders, people in leadership roles, who really couldn't manage during the pandemic because it was such a crisis. And what I was saying is I was really looking forward to interviewing you and talking about this crisis, because it is something that every leader has to be prepared for, because it's not a matter of if a crisis happens, it's really just when it's going to happen. And then how are you going to show up in the middle of that? Because you can only control you. So maybe you can distinguish a little bit between what makes somebody a successful leader during a crisis and what makes someone not successful. And I think when we kind of define that, we'll be able to flesh out a little bit more of some of those skill sets.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think I got really interested when I started writing the book. This definitely bubbled for me during the pandemic, like everybody else. I was having coaching clients and things that were coming to me with different kinds of problems than they normally came with. Everybody was suddenly leading remotely. What did that mean? Burnout was suddenly really high. Kids are at home. How are you supposed to do all these things? And your kids are in the background all the time. And, just different types of problems were bubbling up. So it got me really curious. And what I actually started with was like, let me pull out the research book. Like, what have we been telling leaders about crisis management? What's the body of work there? And when you really start looking into how we've talked about crisis over time, it's been like, hey, here's this set of tools, and you take out these 3 things and you do these 3 things, and then you're going to be fine.
That's when the crisis hits. Like you're in the middle of a crisis, look and follow the steps.
Follow these steps. It's do these 3 things, and then you're going to be fine. The pandemic was not that. That's not what this was. Like, that was not going to do it. It's just not going to cut it. And the more I thought about it, the more I was like, why is that ever how we've talked about it? That's not what's going to help. And I got this hypothesis in my head of what it's going to be is the people who already spend a lot of time thinking about who they are as a leader and have spent the time to develop really foundational leadership skills. Those are the ones that are going to be okay. The ones who were already struggling before the crisis hit.
Work.
Yeah,
who've
exactly.
Done their work.
Absolutely. The ones who've done their work and really prioritized it are going to be fine. And that is what I found across the board. That theory proved to be true.
And I can't say how many times we've said that here at Leadership School and other episodes, is that leadership and being a successful leader is all about doing your personal development work.
Absolutely.
You've got to do that work. So what is the kind of work that these successful leaders are doing in advance to prepare them for these crises? And who were the ones that were successful during the pandemic?
Yeah. I mean, I had such phenomenal conversations with leaders while I was writing the book. But I think one of the things that people do that is really, really important is starting with, do you have a clear vision of why you're even a leader? I tell the story a lot when I speak of the accidental leader. And when I look back on my own leadership journey, that was me too. I became a leader for the first time by accident. I didn't even know I was going to have a direct report. My very first job I had at a college, I was a nurse recruiter at a hospital. And my first day, they were like, oh, and yeah, by the way, you're going to have our HR assistant is going to report to you. And I was like, pardon? Huh? And I was 23. What did I know about leading anybody?
How many of us has that happened to?
Right.
I mean, we don't even know that we're leaders. I didn't even know that I was a leader until someone said, well, you're a leadership coach. And I went, well, I can't do that because I'm not a leader. That's not true.
Yes.
I just didn't believe it.
Exactly. And I think that happens to a lot of people. So there has to be a moment, hopefully, where you pull up and go, oh yeah, I'm a leader. Let me really reflect on why it is that I'm doing that. And one of my favorite bodies of work on that topic is by Patrick Lencioni, which, everybody knows for like 5 Dysfunctions of a Team and some of the other great books that he has. But he wrote a book right before the pandemic hit called The Motive that I feel like a lot of people just missed. I don't know. I think because of the pandemic, I got kind of lost in the noise. But The Motive talks all about basically, there should be one reason you get into leadership, and it should be because you want to serve people. You want to be of service to the people that you're leading. And if that's not the reason, then this is probably not the job for you. If it was power, a pay raise, you think the title after your name is going to make you feel more whole, that's not it. That's not the reason to do it. So I think a lot of it, that's a difference maker. Like the people who are really intentional about understanding that they are a leader and understanding the why of that, and then communicating that through things like having a really strong set of values that they're using to make decisions with. There's a great story in the book, probably one of my favorite conversations I had. I just kind of randomly through a series of events met the county commissioner for Broward County in Florida, which is like Fort Lauderdale, that part. Do you remember that story from the book?
I do remember this story because it was very impactful.
So yes, just as an aside, I was talking to her about all these other things. And just as an aside, she starts telling this story about the cruise ships. Does everybody remember at the beginning of the pandemic, there were all these cruise ships that were stuck at sea and nobody wanted to take them because there were COVID positive people on board. People were scared to have those folks land and then have to deal with those patients, but they were also really concerned about the spread of disease coming off of that. And you've got people on ships from all different countries. So it was a really, really complicated issue. She was under incredible pressure from even the president to not accept these people on ships. And getting phone calls from all over the place. And she was like, at the end of the day, I finally just had to gut check. These are humans and they need somewhere to go. And I can figure out how to help them. So I'm going to. And
what was her name again?
Let's just call her Monica because I'm not going to say her last name right. And she's the sweetest human.
She deserves some credit because
oh my God, she's amazing.
Did a really big thing in here. So maybe we could talk a little bit more. So she is the one who decided and made the decision that all of these people on the cruise ships would be able to come into port. And then then started dealing with that crisis.
Yes.
Now you've got all these people from all over the world. And so tell me, from what you can remember, what are some of the things that she had to do and how she had to navigate? And
so she had to they basically set up a procedure for what to do with all the folks. Typically, county commissioners in some cases are actually in charge of things like EMTs, paramedics, firefighters. Sometimes that reports up through the county structure. So she had to do a bunch of coordination with those kind of folks. There was a lot of reporting that happened, honestly, as a result of it too, where she's communicating a lot of things with a lot of people. So it was a lot of juggling. I thought what was fascinating about the story though, was that really, I think the difference maker for her and what made this such a great leadership moment is how connected she truly was to what was most important to her. And it wasn't, okay, what's going to be the best thing for my career in this moment? It's what's the right thing to do? What is truly the right thing to do?
So she decided what the right thing was to do.
Yeah.
To do was to really help these people, allow these cruise ships to come in, and then dealing with what that looked like after that, and knowing that her value was this was the right thing.
Yeah,
so, that's it, right? It turned out okay. It was a lot of hard work, but it turned out okay. Well, we had a pandemic, but it wasn't her fault.
Exactly. Nothing that had to do with what Monica did. But she's such a cool person. And so at the time, I believe she was actually the assistant county commissioner. She's gotten promoted to county commissioner since then. So it didn't even have, career repercussions at the time. I think people really saw who she was as a human, and that resonated.
So breaking it down, she knew what her value was doing the right thing and caring for the humanity here.
Yep.
And she said, the rest is going to figure it out. I'm focused on my values, and all the decisions from here are going to filter through that. And because of that, she really helped hundreds of lives. So tell me about like this value process. I mean, this is something that I know Brene Brown goes through a lot.
Absolutely.
And a lot of coaches go through this. A lot of trainers go through this. So what does this look like to really determine your values? And I mean, what are they? What are your values? Let's get very, very specific here.
Yeah. So I think the best process is, in my book, there's a values list. You can find them on the internet. You can actually, there's one on my website you can grab even. And it's a list of just value words. And you don't even have to start with a list. Most people probably have some sort of idea of a couple words that are going to be important. And the important thing is to filter through those through the lens of, I think the right question to be thinking of is, what's the litmus test? Like, how do I make a decision? What's going to be that tipping point? And I have done this exercise for years as a leadership facilitator, had a list of 5 for ages. And then Brene Brown, when she wrote Dare to Lead, she really started like trying to.
She was like, you need 2.
Pressure,
you could only have 2.
You can have 2 and the other 3 go away. And it felt hard in the moment, but I landed pretty quickly on mine, which my core 2 are hope and curiosity. And I really try to use those as both a guiding principle, but also as, if I feel stuck and I'm trying to make a decision, those are things I lean on in order to hopefully land a decision that I know is going to feel good to me.
And what's really interesting about them is that was very natural, probably, because when mine are hope and connection. So we have that one in common.
Funny.
Hope and connection. But when you realize that you're already living your life through those values and you're just putting a name to them.
Yeah, you're just labeling it.
And that's all. But having that is really helpful when you're trying to make decisions, because you can you go, if I filter these decisions through these 2 values, what makes the most sense?
Yeah. And I think the other thing it does for leaders, and I think sometimes this is something we don't talk about enough. Part of the reason why this is important is that the clearer you are about your values and what's most important to you as a leader, the better you're going to be able to communicate who you are to your team. And one of the best things you can do for trust building and really forming strong relationships with the people that are on your team is to be as intentional as possible about who you are, be as transparent as possible about what's important to you, how you're going to make decisions. And if you don't have clarity of that, like at the naming level, that some of your best intention is going to get lost in the wash because it's not as crystal clear as it could be. So the clearer you are, the clearer your communication about what's important to you is going to be. And then that's going to translate to a trust bump every time.
So it's communicating. And when you're communicating your values, you're communicating what it is that, like, who you are.
Absolutely.
And you're building that relationship and that connection and that relationship too.
Yeah.
For those of you listening, make sure to listen to the episode we just did on trust with Marie Claire Ross. And we also did one just recently on decision making. So listen back to those decision making with Nicole Coustier, because what we're talking about now is kind of bringing all that together so we can really break down some of those in those other episodes. To continue with what you were saying, Beth, that values and being able to filter all that through that value and bringing that trust, those are really the skills that you need to be able to handle a crisis.
Absolutely. And they become even more important in times of crisis. So they're important every day. But if you think about, like, let's go back to like March 2020. Did having clarity of values help people at that moment for the people who had it? You better believe it, right? That was absolutely something they could lean on for decisions. And if you were at all wishy-washy, or maybe not even wishy-washy, but unintentional about it, that was going to make things more difficult.
I'm curious about that unintentional piece that you just said, because I think what I've noticed is that the more you practice things, the less you really have to think about it, because in some of that crisis moment, you're not going to like, okay, let's everybody stop. We're going to take an hour and talk about our values, and then let's get to filter the decision through that. Remember what our values are, but you're kind of like making decisions and you're just going because you have to, and you just have to do the next step. But hopefully you've already done your personal development work that all of that is easier.
Yes.
So when you're saying you're not unintentional about it, maybe you can explain what that means a little bit. Like, because I think that there are times when we're going to sit down and be intentional about this decision. Does this reflect who we are? But then there are times when you're like, we just have to go. You have to move.
And I think part of it is, again, the clearer you are about it and the more transparent it is to you, it becomes part of that internal gut. Like, gut instinct that we all have, especially when you have to make really quick decisions. It just becomes part of that wiring. And sometimes you won't even realize it was a values decision until afterwards, but you can see the trail from it. The other interesting thing that I think is related to this, so this is something that's not in the book. Like if I had one thing to have back, if there's one page I would want to add to the book, there is
book
a conversation.
Book 2's coming.
No, it's probably not. Maybe one day, but I need a break. But the thing that I wish was in it that I really came to as I started teaching this content to groups and started speaking about it more, I had this aha about how decisions and connection affect our leadership style during times of crisis. So I had this fascinating conversation with a leader named Heather Haas, who talked about, man, for some of the clients that she was working with, there were clients early on who were just like, I'm just going to put my head in the sand. I'm just going to pretend this is not happening. And I'm going to kind of be in a state of denial. And they just sat for a bit. And then there were some who like ran into action really, really quickly, but maybe made a lot of terrible decisions. We all had kind of this default that happened. And I started trying to unpack that more. And I think the thing, like if you picture like a 4-box quadrant and at the bottom, picture connection with others. And then on the up and down, picture decision-making speed. Okay. So can you stay both connected to people and still make high quality decisions? That's the box you're shooting for. And if you just have one, let's say I'm just really great at connection, but I'm not really great at making rapid decisions, I'm going to be a fantastic cheerleader, right? So man, rah, rah, everybody's doing great, but they don't know what to do and they don't know where the next thing's coming from. And oh, I didn't tell them about the procedure that just got changed. I'm just really a great cheerleader. There's value in that for sure, but it's not going to make you a huge asset for your team during a crisis.
If that's your role, then that's awesome. And you have to we need those people because
absolutely.
I mean, think about when you're on a race course or a sporting event. Like I'm thinking about the races that I've ran and the stretches where there was nobody on the race. It's terrible. But when you've got people there who are like, yeah, and holding up their signs and going, I mean, you're like, I can do this. Da, da, da.
Yes.
You've got that. So you need all those people, but we're talking about being able to make those high stakes decisions, crisis moment decisions. You've got to be able to be well connected and be able to make that decision.
Yes.
You have to have both of those things. You can't just be that cheerleader.
Absolutely. And honestly, like this is a little bit hard for me to say because I'm not really a black and white person like this, but I think you can be just a cheerleader, but then you're not the leader. And that's okay. But then you're not the leader because the leader has to do the decision stuff too. Like that's part of the job. So then we have folks who aren't doing anything. They're not connecting with people and they're not making high quality decisions. Then we've got our folks who are great at making the decision part, but nobody's behind them because they're not stopping to even connect with people and make sure.
We struggle with the trust part in that.
Absolutely.
Like, you're not going to trust that person, even if they're making good decisions because you don't have that relationship with them.
Right. Is everybody burned out? Is anybody showing up to work still? Like you don't even know because you're so far ahead of them. So it's really about being in balance, I think, with those two things. Can you stay connected to people? Make sure that you can bring them in when there's time, when it's necessary for certain decisions, right? But then can you still move the ball forward in the way that needs to happen and at the pace it typically needs to happen during crisis?
And I want to say that I think that there's a growth process that happens here because I can look in all of those that you're talking about and remember all times in my life when I've been all of those things.
Absolutely. Me too.
And it's funny because I have like a big case of imposter syndrome. And so I start to think, well, people aren't going to think that I'm a good leader because of this situation. Well, in that situation, I was the cheerleader or I was the worker or whatever it was in that moment. My kids think I'm just like the dictator decision maker, like even though I'm working on the relationship there, I think that's just natural. And so there are different times in my life and in our lives when we are different roles, but as we're growing, we're fluctuating a little bit.
Absolutely.
And I think in different places of our life, like for being in our friend circle, we might not be that connected leader. We might be the cheerleader, but in our job, we might be a different role.
Yeah, so I think that's absolutely true.
I guess what the values comes in is knowing what's your value for this role in this situation.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think it's also something that can flex. Like even if you hit that perfect balance, sometimes you're not going to hit it all the time. And that's okay. But I think the consciousness of understanding that that's what's happening and just continuing to try to push yourself into that balance mode of those two things as much as you can, that's what's going to be helpful. Pop yourself out of it as quickly as you can.
Hey, thanks so much for listening. Since you've listened this far, it tells me you're really enjoying the content. And I'm so grateful. I work really hard to bring you some awesome resources to help really enhance your leadership game. If you're liking this, can you pause really quickly? Make sure you're subscribed, but then also share with one person or more people who you think could really benefit from the content. My goal is to really bring this into some of the top podcasts on leadership in the world, and you can help get there and help us grow by sharing this with everyone you know. Thank you so much. I'm glad you're enjoying the episode. So in your book, you have mentioned 3 different types of leader, and you kind of alluded to them a little bit briefly. Mm-hmm. And you said you've got your head in the sand leader, and then what were the other 2?
Yeah, so they're head in the sand, and then knee jerk is what's in the book. And then the folks who are striking that balance, that's what I like to call a crisis proof leader. Those are the ones who are really walking that balancing act.
So what are some other things that we can start doing now to really develop these skills that we need for when those crises happens? And what are some of those other skills that we might need that we might not have mentioned yet?
Yeah. So I think the place that I start in the book, and the place that I would encourage any leader to start that wants to start building skills, is you always have to start with you. Always have to start with the work that is you. And so that's, again, getting clear of things like values. It's getting really clear about why you're a leader, and maybe even taking the time. I have this activity in the book, and it's something I encourage leaders to do all the time in classes and programs and things like that, which is to get really, really clear about a leadership philosophy. Like, could you, in a couple of sentences, say who you are as a leader and be able to share that with somebody else? And so to have that level of clarity about who you want to show up as a leader and how you want to be as a leader, really, really important. And then I think the other piece of the self-awareness is, do you know who you are from a standpoint of what are you really fantastic at? What do you just knock out of the park? And what are you just an absolute disaster at? Do you have a full understanding? Because we all have those things. It doesn't matter who you are. There is no such thing, in my opinion, as a perfect leader or a perfect, balance of things you can just always take on every task and be 100%. That's just not how we're wired. But when we have awareness of who we are and what we're good at and what we're not, hopefully that also helps us with authenticity and trust too. That's another sneaky trust thing, where if I'm trying to pretend like I'm the expert on something that I'm not, that's a trust breaker. I see you and I see that you're not good at that, and you're trying to pretend to me that you are. Now I have to question the behaviors that I'm seeing. There's misalignment. So the clearer you can be about those things, and even just allowing yourself and others to not be good at things and have conversations about that, that's how teams get stronger. I was just telling this story to a group last week. Just like everybody else, I think one of the sneaky leadership things that a lot of people struggle with is delegation. It's one of those things that, man, you'd think as a leader should be really easy and we should all be really great at it. Man, a lot of leaders struggle with it. And I would put myself in that box, getting better at it, still working it. But that's something that I still, I could still do some more work on it. Something I talk to my own coach about a lot. And I remember having this conversation with somebody on my team, and I was complaining I had to do some metrics thing. I had the spreadsheet open and she was asking me for help with something else. And I was like, I would badly like to help you with that thing. I am drowning in this data and I've got to get this report done by the end of the day. And I'm going to lose my mind. My head's going to explode. I really got to focus on this. And she was like, oh, what are you working on? So I showed it, pulled it up and showed it to her. Started talking to her about it. And she was like, oh, I can help you with that. I love doing stuff like that. And number one, I didn't know that. I didn't know that she liked to do things like that. And second, the light that was in her eyes when she started talking to me about this data, I was like, what? I hadn't been delegating it because I assumed everybody felt the way that I did about it, which is a stupid thing to assume, right? So she was like, let me have it. In 15 minutes, she had the thing done. She loved it. She said, I have ideas for how I can improve it. I could just do that for you every month. And I was like, heck yeah, that'd be awesome. And I think so often when we don't communicate our struggle, we also don't fix those things. And there were times when she would come to me and say, man, this is something I'm just really struggling with. I'm not sure I'm in my sweet spot here. And we would look for somebody else on the team that it might be their sweet spot. And demonstrating and modeling that kind of vulnerability, I think, is really, really important.
Wow, that's such a powerful story, because I'm thinking about all the times when we feel like we have to say yes because no one else is going to do it, or no one else has time for that. And so we say yes to all this stuff.
Yes.
And by us saying yes to things that we're not actually gifted at, we are actually preventing someone who is their joy and their
exactly
experience.
Right. Exactly right.
So I think it comes on us as leaders to be able to notice those things. And again, we might not always get it right. And as we're talking about self-awareness, I don't want to include shaming or in there. Like there should not be any of this. There should not be like, well, I'm so bad at this and that and this, and I'm just terrible. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about like knowing your greatnesses and knowing where you're not skilled at, so that you can do just what you said, give those skills to somebody who finds joy in them, and we can find joy in the things that we're great at. And there's no shame in like not being great at this data. It's just not what you're great at. That other person is not great at the things that you're great at.
Exactly. And it's just another form of synergy that can happen in teams when we let it. And so often we're the thing that stops that from happening.
Well, yeah. So in your book, you start walking us through these like 7 leadership competencies. We've mentioned several of them, but maybe let's just go down the row, and make sure we've hit them all.
Yeah, absolutely. So I call these principles of prepared leadership. So these are things that hopefully, if you've spent a little bit of time on, if you've done your work, as we've talked about, these are things that are going to help you in times of crisis. So I talk about these in each chapter of the book. I talk about them both in like, why is it important just in day-to-day life? But then what are some things you might want to tweak or dial up or dial down during times of crisis? So it's got kind of both pieces. You're getting a 2-for-1 in the conversations about that. So we already talked about the one. I like to call it extreme self-awareness, because I think especially in times of crisis, the higher that is, the higher your level and awareness is, the better that's going to serve you. I think it's important for it to be as high as it can be. Then we've got resilience. I think if any skill also was a difference maker the last couple years, it was that one. So it was also, can you run the marathon that has been the last couple of years and picking yourself back up? And that's been challenging for a lot of folks. So I deep dive in that chapter about what are some things you need to keep your eye on from a resilience perspective. And if you're struggling in areas, what are some things you can kind of tweak and experiment with? Then we've got results oriented. So that's, can I do these things? Like, can I be self-aware? Can I be resilient? Can I lead a team? But also, can I keep my eye on the bottom line too, of whatever the mission is of my team? And I think, again, during times of crisis, that just ramps up 100%, especially if you think about, I think this was especially critical when in 2020, there were teams that were cut, right? People lost jobs because as budgets were affected by what was happening, the teams who couldn't make a case for why they existed and show the value we're providing to the organization, they weren't necessarily going to be around. So the importance of that and knowing how you operate and focus on results, really critical. So those are the skills that I really think are about you, your own personal results drive, your own personal resilience, your own personal self-awareness. And then I really pivot into what are the things that are really other focused. So that are really for the people on your team. And that starts with building trust. There is nothing else you can do that is more important than building trust with the people who work for you. So there's a whole chapter on that. I think empathy is the sleeper. It's the sleeper leadership competency for a lot of years that those of us who have done this work, man, we've been talking about empathy for ages. But I feel like the last couple of years is when we've finally gotten some street cred where people are like, oh yeah, that is actually helping us with some of these things. So empathy is really important. I have a dear friend who's an empathy expert that I interviewed for that chapter of the book. And there's just some really great practical tips in it. Then we talk about the importance of communicating clearly. And again, that's another one that during a time of crisis, you're going to really want to ramp up. One of my favorite activities probably in the whole book that I had done with some one-on-one clients and I knew was impactful, but man, if there's something I get an email about, it's this one, which just shocks me to death. But the number of people who are walking around operating under the assumption that email is required. Is the required method of communication for all things always. That has just become like a cultural norm. And one of the discussions that I have in that chapter is just like take a hard look at how are you using things like email, text messaging, instant messaging, Slack, all of this technology that we have available to do the work that your team does. And are those things working? Maybe they are. Maybe it's perfect. Maybe email is not a problem at your organization, but I hardly ever talk to a leader that isn't drowning in email and up till 10 at night trying to keep up with the flow of information. And my first pushback to that is always like, have you talked to your team about maybe doing something different? Like maybe experiment with, should you do a daily stand-up huddle and everybody keeps their list and you just go through those things every morning and then you don't have to answer 45 emails during the day about those things.
Everybody keeps track of all their questions and only emails you once.
Exactly. Or, just experiment. You may not always have control of who emails you, but man, you have a lot of control over what happens on your team. And just pulling up and saying, let's talk about what's working and what's not from a method perspective for communication, I think is really, really critical. And I know that's been a interesting, just culture push that I'm really trying to fight the fight of, man, we don't have to do everything.
Well, I think there are a lot of systems now that help with that. I mean, you've got your project management softwares and CRMs and things that can help manage all of those things to fan out those responsibilities over a team. And really thinking what are the important jobs for me to do? Do I not need to be doing? So I did a really fun exercise yesterday. I was in a workshop with David Nagel, who is the host of the Successful Mind podcast and has this whole thing, Your Life Now or whatever. But they did this cool exercise that was really helpful. They said, take 5 minutes and write down all of the tasks that you do in a day. And write down everything, even if it's make your bed, whatever they are, write all of the tasks that you do in the day. Then go back and highlight or circle the ones that do not require your specific area of expertise. And when you really look at that, you're like, oh, I have a list of 27. I only actually need to do 3. And so then it's, okay, you need to be delegating all those other tasks. Yeah. And leveraging your team, leveraging the money that you have, leveraging other things to be filling in those gaps. So it was a really helpful exercise and going, oh, yes, it's true that I actually, as a leader, I don't need to be answering all of these emails. Yeah. My admin assistant can filter through and tell me which exactly ones that I need to do or little things like that.
Yeah. And sometimes, I have coaching clients who will be like, I get probably 12 emails a day from this one employee with, really granular questions. And that's almost always a sign of, have you empowered the employee to make the decision themselves? If you continue to just respond to the employee and let them know what to do, they're going to think they're doing what you want them to do if you're never pushing back on it. So just stop and say, hey, I trust you. I know you're going to make the right decision. And here are the types of things that I do want you to email me about. It's just these specific things. Or if you're really struggling, let me know. But just get more specific about what's happening, And
you mentioned trust there. It goes back to that. If you don't actually trust this person, then you need to figure out what's going on there. Yeah. What is it? Is this person in the right role or are you in the right role?
Exactly.
It goes back to that trust. We have to be able to trust our team to do the work and we have to empower them to do that and give them the tools and resources they need to be able to do it well. If you're going to just throw someone in a job and be like, okay, go do it. And then they don't even have the password to your CRM, then they're going to really struggle. Right? Exactly. You have to empower them to do the things that they need to do and trust them to do it right. And if it's not happening right, then that's that feedback loop that we can go into a whole different podcast episode on what that looks like and how to provide appropriate feedback.
Exactly.
Do we make it through our list?
We have one more, which is growing others. And this is something, again, over the course of the last couple of years, for a lot of leaders, it was easy to lose sight of development. Are you keeping an eye on what do they need to feel fulfilled, to feel like their career is moving forward? It was easy to kind of set that to the side. And now is the time to pick it back up. If you've still got that to the side, you're a year past when you should have picked that back up, because I think that is part of the retention issues that we're having, some of the quiet quitting things that are happening. It's leaders who haven't picked that back up yet. You've got to make sure your folks know that they're valued, they have a career progression, and that you care about that development. So keeping your eye, not losing sight on that during crisis is really important.
That's so awesome. Beth, is there anything else that you think would be really important for people to hear about how to prepare for a crisis as a leader that we haven't mentioned yet? Other than read your book. Tell us the name of your book again.
Oh, bless. It's called Crisis Proof Leadership, and it's available wherever you buy books. So,
and we'll have that in the show notes, a link to that in the show notes. But back to that question, is there anything else that you
I don't think there's anything. It's been such a thorough, really fun, engaging conversation. So I think we really hit the highlights. I think what I would just encourage all of your listeners to do is just really take some of the things we've chatted about today to heart and really stop and think. Do you know things like your motive? Do you know your values? Have you done some of your work? And if not, now's the time to do it.
And to always be doing it.
Yeah.
It's not like, oh, I did my work and now I'm good.
Exactly. I'm done. Yeah. That's what I always tell people about self-awareness. Boy, about the second you think you're self-aware, that's when like the blind spot is like sneaking up behind you. But self-awareness is like a constant. Like you have to keep your eye on that. You're never done. You're never checking.
It's like humility the minute you're like, oh, I'm so humble.
I know. It's like, oh, well, I'm not anymore. Exactly.
Right. It is an ongoing thing. And we are going to be a different leader next year than we were this year.
Absolutely.
And we should not judge other people for who the leaders they were last year, because they've grown just like you have, and just always be working. There's always something more to do. Plus culture is always changing and shifting. And
Absolutely.
So we're going to, think about the culture 30 years ago and the types of leaders that we had 30 years ago to now, and how just the work environment has shifted and changed for the good, mostly way. So things will always be shifting and changing. And if you're not always doing that work, then you're going to be behind it. It's where do you want to be in your leadership journey? Beth, before I let you go, I ask each leader the same 2 questions. And this is about you personally, not just like what you think people should think and do. So you personally, what does integrity mean to you?
Yeah, for me, I think it's got kind of 2 components. So I think this is a super common, definition of integrity, but I always think of integrity as, doing the thing that you would do if people were watching, even when they're not, like being, staying true to that. But there's an additional component for me for integrity, which is, am I behaving and aligning with my values and who I said I was? Is that in congruence? And if it's not, am I being called on that so that I can correct it? That's always my goal. So
that's awesome. Well, I'm really excited to ask you this next question, because you talk a lot in your book about burnout.
Yes.
And I love that you mentioned the burnout book, the Bachelor sisters. That's a really
such
important
a fantastic book.
It's so good. And there's a lot. There's so much talking about burnout right now. I'm a burnout coach. You got Thrive. You got so many companies and organizations focused on burnout because it was already on the rise pre-pandemic. Pandemic hit, and now we're seeing it. And it's actually a medical condition now with a medical definition, mental, emotional, physical exhaustion from overwork or stress. So this is a really big issue. So I'm curious, for you personally, you have a child, you have your own business. I see your dog in the back of the picture there. So what does it look like for you to live a balanced life? What does that mean? And what does it look like?
Yeah. I think just like everyone else, I don't know anybody who answers that question and is like, man, I've got it figured out. Here's the thing you need to do. I just don't think that's how balance works. I like to think of it. I read a book a bajillion years ago, and I'm not going to get the title of it right, but it basically talked about your life being like a 3-ring circus, right? And you need to know what ring you're in. You need to know, are you in the work ring? Are you in the home ring? Are you in the self ring? Like what ring are you in? And I think about that a lot. And I really do try to make sure that I've got a balance in the ring. Like, am I in all 3 rings? Like, am I hitting them all? Do I feel like I'm spending too much time in one of them? And I've certainly had periods in my life where work was taking up a bigger chunk of time than I wanted it to. I talk in the book about, I think as a working parent, man, that balance can feel hard sometimes, even when you're really putting your time and energy in assessment. I think 2020 was the first year that I didn't write down, I wish I had gotten more time with my kid when I reflected on my goals, because I feel like we all got plenty of time with our kid in 2020, right? Plenty of time. Maybe too much time. But, that was the first year I had ever not written it down. I always felt like, man, I wish there was more. And part of my draw to starting my own business was I wanted the flexibility to be able to decide when and how I worked. And so I would say for me, balance right now is better. It's still a challenge. And my particular type of work is very seasonal. So I get really busy seasons and then really slow seasons and then really busy seasons. So it's kind of like riding a roller coaster all the time. And my kind of mantra I keep in my head is to let yourself be busy when it's busy and to let yourself rest when it's slow. Like take care of the other things when it's slow and to just be really conscious of it. And I do feel like it is an ebb and flow thing. It's never in a constant state of balance. And I think it's just about keeping your eye on it and noticing when that's out of alignment and trying to make some shifts. But I wish I had all the answers. I really do. I really wish I had a game-changing answer on that one, but
there's no answer. There's no right answer. It's not a game-changing answer. Like that's not out there because it's going to be different for everybody. And I really just like hearing from you. Like as I'm interviewing and talking to all these leaders from all around the world, everybody finds that balance in their life in a different way. And so it's really, I'm hopeful that just something will maybe click in a listener's mind and they'll think, oh, I can do that. Or that's more achievable to me, or that's a way that I could achieve balance in my life is doing it the way they do. Just hearing that from different people, I think is really, really helpful.
Well, and
because it is an ebb and flow. Like it's like a seesaw, or a bicycle. So Chris Kelso mentioned a bicycle in our imposter syndrome talk that, you're always making minor adjustments.
Yeah, I love that. And I think the important thing about asking the question, what I love about you asking it, and I hope people are being honest in the answer of, I think it can look like, especially in our world of social media, that like there are people out there who have it figured out, like that person, they've got it figured out. And the reality of it again is that it's not ever, it is going to be that thing. And I think there's absolute value in continuing to pursue it and continuing to be in tune for it in your life. But if you're shooting for the perfect, because you think somebody's got it figured out, like I love the transparency in that everyone struggles with it from time to time. It's always going to be like that.
Yeah. I like think about how like people I admire or really famous, really wealthy people, they still have garbage.
Exactly.
And it still stinks.
That's right. They still have to take out the trash.
They still have those little things happening.
Exactly.
Everybody's normal. I mean, we all have the same issues and things back and forth, and we just approach them or see them in a different way. So, cool. Well, Beth, this has been really delightful. I have learned so much, and it's really helping me reflect back onto my own leadership. And I like your self-awareness piece because I'm thinking, wow, there are times when I read your book and I thought of one particular conversation when I was like, I was not self-aware in that conversation at all, but it actually ended up benefiting me. So it was fine. But I'm just thinking through like, okay, how can I be more of these things? And this is why these conversations are so beneficial because we're all learning, we're all in this leadership journey together. So, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and for the conversation. And it's just been really a pleasure.
Of course. Thanks for having me. It's been a blast.
Thank you for joining me on this journey to grow in our leadership. If you enjoyed this episode, you've got to check out the leadership and self-care coaching programs on my website at kylakofer.com. Let's change the world together.